purging our campuses of any monument, mural, or statue that offends anybody for any reason. A conversation with Graham Pirro and Professor Robbie George of Princeton University, next on Campus Roundup. Hello, I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the Campus Roundup at the College Fix. Our top story segment today focuses on progressive universities erasing history in the name of social justice progressive ideals, getting rid of monuments because they offend people. To talk more about this, we welcome Graham Pirro, a staff reporter at the College Fix. Graham, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Duke.
As we begin here, give me your view of this. What do you generally make of this rush by universities to sort of purge their own history of any figure or monument or statue or pennant that may offend anybody on campus?
Yeah, so what I find most interesting about this movement is there always seems to be a difference in how the target of the progressivism relates to the university. If you take a situation like Stanford's, where they're renaming features on campus that are named for Junipero Serra, who was a Catholic saint who doesn't actually have a direct relationship to the university. If you compare that to a situation like UNC, which took down the Silent Sam statue because of a campus mob, and that's supposed to be a monument or memorial to the Civil War. So it's different parts of American history that have some questionable parts and legacies that America is trying to deal with right now. And they're coming back to sort of haunt the university's presence in the forms of campus mobs and progressive activism.
Yeah, mobs and activism are the key. I mean, if you're looking for a sanitized version of history, good luck. The minute you get rid of all Western culture in the name of progressivism, then you got to start looking at the Aztecs torturing other Native Americans. You got to look at non-Western people being complicit, Islam and complicit in the slave trade. But they don't want to take it that far. The obvious story, right, the one that you wrote about that's really popular is Silent Sam. Tell us a little bit at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who is Silent Sam and what's going on with the protests there?
Sure. So Silent Sam is a statue that was displayed in a very prominent location on UNC's campus. And it's essentially a monument to all of the soldiers who died for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And what happened was in mid-August, a mob of campus activists forcibly tore down the statue. And since then, there have been a couple of protests, one of which I covered in person. And essentially, the argument right now and the debate that's happening is coming from mixed signals from the UNC Board of Trustees and the UNC Board of Governors as to what exactly to do with the Silent Sam statue. And from my reporting, it doesn't look likely that the statue is going back to its original place on campus, which again was in a very prominent location. But there's a very good chance that it will go somewhere on campus, perhaps a museum, but certainly not back to its very visible location.
The thing that I find most troubling about the UNC story is that you actually had kids engaging in illegal vandalism. The university had said, we are going to decide what to do with the statue. And these kids, these students, and these activists wouldn't wait. They tore it down in the presence of police officers. I'm always amazed that police officers are ordered to stand down and let primarily progressive kids engage in this form of vandalism. The second story you mentioned is big, too. Stanford University and Father Junipero Serra, the idea that the mission organization all the way through the state of California is now the missionary, the Catholic missionary movement, is now branded offensive to Native Americans. Talk about that one.
Sure. So this one started a couple of years ago with the student movement on campus to get Junipero Serra's name removed. And essentially, they're claiming that the mission system that Serra played a very large role in founding in California it played a large role in the oppression and mistreatment of Native Americans. Now, there's no consideration of Junipero Serra's personal history. As far as most historical records go, he was a very upstanding, someone who was Catholic, deeply religious, but that isn't being taken into account. Instead, what activists are looking for, what the university is really capitulating to, are demands to reckon with the history of the mission system. And that, I think, doesn't give Serra enough credit in terms of what he did in his personal life and the contribution that he made to California's history in general.
Yeah, I admire the subtlety of the articles you've worked on and the stories you've reported. That nuance, I think, is important, right? That there are a lot of things on the table here. The one thing I think is fair to say is that in many cases, the universities, the professors behind this, the faculty, are being quite reactionary in the sense that rather than engage in serious and as universities, if we're not willing to do this exist, why do we exist? We're not willing to wade into serious intellectual controversies that have multiple angles. If our first response is to silence or pull down or censor rather than engage the broader community in discussion, we're really failing our kids, we're failing our communities.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like I said previously, UC Berkeley has appeared to be the least reactionary because of the fact that they already changed the official name back in 2008. So they clearly have put some thought into this. But yeah, I think the other schools are mostly reacting to extreme activism on campus right now.
So Graham, thank you so much for your work. We really appreciate your articles. And I suspect we'll be seeing you here again real soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Graham. Time now for Expert Talk, where we take an opportunity to seek out the opinions of education specialists. I'm joined today by Professor Robbie George, one of the country's leading conservative intellectuals. Professor George is a legal scholar, political philosopher, public intellectual who serves as the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Professor George, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Well, one of the things I most admire about your career is how deeply steeped in Constitution and American history you are, and the way that you have been willing to engage the larger culture about these issues. One of the great concerns that a lot of us have is the degree to which academics, university professors, administrators are beginning to argue that any aspect of American culture or history that could be seen as problematic to any minority group must be removed. And this kind of censorship, the erasure of monuments. Wanted to get your thoughts on what's driving this.
Well, much of it, of course, is being driven by ideology, a desire to prevail on contemporary disputed issues by reinterpreting the past. Now, the question of how the past ought to be interpreted is always on the table. We should always be open to those who challenge prevailing interpretations of the past, prevailing interpretations of our history, but it needs to be a fair debate, not one in which a thumb is placed on the scale by academic institutions themselves to determine the outcome of the debate, one way or another. I think it is important, as my liberal colleague, Professor Stanley Katz, one of the great American historians of our time, points out, that we avoid the vice of what's sometimes called presentism, that is, evaluating figures from the past and movements of the past exclusively on the basis of standards of the present, or standards of one segment along the ideological spectrum of the present. It's important to engage the past, to understand the past on its own terms. The past is a complicated place. Understanding it's difficult, and understanding it on its own terms is important. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot, when we shift to the normative mode of inquiry and analysis, pass judgment on past institutions. I think we can and we should. There's every reason to condemn slavery, segregation, exploitation. Absolutely. And to the extent that these things were accepted in the past, they need to be condemned. Yet they also have to be understood. We have to understand, for example, how it could be the case that otherwise reasonable people of goodwill, people who were honest, people who were faithful in their personal relationships, people who had integrity that was admired by almost everyone in their time, could nevertheless have believed in very bad things. And that applies across the board. That applies to people who believed in slavery, and that applies to people who, like so many progressives, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, believed in eugenics. I think we have to ask ourselves, why could progressive thinkers or jurists or intellectuals like Oliver Wendell Holmes have believed in eugenics? Eugenics is a bad thing. It ought to be condemned from a moral point of view. And yet, we need to avoid the flaw of presentism. We need to evaluate people like Holmes by the standards of the time for purposes of understanding the time, understanding history. So I think as long as we sort things out and are careful in our analysis and draw the proper distinctions, we can accomplish what people of goodwill on both sides want to accomplish, and that is to have and to make sound moral judgments, even about past practices, but also to understand the past on its own terms, and not to simply use ideology to reinterpret the past for the purpose of winning contemporary ideological or political battles.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. One of the things I like to teach my own students is Greek and Roman history. So in reading a writer like Plutarch, for instance, we see that you can tell an accurate historical story and still then come away with trying to morally assess how these characters in the past were, trying to adjudicate that in a way that is fair. That seems to be the hitch, doesn't it? We all know, and I can't think of a single historian, a single person of good faith on a college campus, a professor, a student, who would try to redeem Nazism from Nazis, right? But when you think about the depredations of Stalin, the depredations of Lenin, you think about the rather different way we seem to treat the depredations of socialism. You mentioned eugenics, a figure like Woodrow Wilson, Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. I mean, if what the academic left is telling us is that tainted institutions, institutions tainted by racism or sexism or bigotry, they can't be reclaimed in the modern era. They have to confront their past and do everything they can to remove it. You see no such impetus to call opprobrium down on modern-day Planned Parenthood for the eugenicist views of its founder. And that ideological divide there, that the same professors who can see it in Robert E. Lee or see it in Columbus seem unable or unwilling to acknowledge it with Stalin or Margaret Sanger.
Yes, it's grossly hypocritical, and there's a double standard there, and it's just not tolerable, and the double standard really does have to be called out. I mean, if we're going to be removing statues of Columbus from public places, then we need to be removing busts of Margaret Sanger from public places, or portraits of Oliver Wendell Holmes. But I think the better course is actually not to be removing those representations from our history, but rather trying to understand these people and the movements they represented on their own terms. I'm very highly critical, as you might imagine if you know anything about me, of Margaret Sanger and of Planned Parenthood, including contemporary Planned Parenthood. I am not on their side, but I want to understand Margaret Sanger, and I want to understand the movement that she led that became Planned Parenthood in a fair-minded way. I don't want there to be a double standard to which they're held, but I also don't want there to be a double standard to which, say, Columbus is held, or Junipero Serra. We have to understand the past and figures from the past and movements from the past on their own terms. And again, as I say, that doesn't mean that we can't make or shouldn't make moral judgments. We should, but we need to keep the relevant distinctions in mind and understand what we're doing when we're doing historiography and what we're doing when we're doing moral philosophy, and the relationship between the two, which is somewhat complicated. Let's not oversimplify these things, and let's not tolerate hypocrisy, and let's not tolerate double standards.
Yeah, I'm an English professor, and so I'm sort of in the belly of the humanities paradigm here. And the thing that gets me all the time is that my academic colleagues are and I admire them for it, they're more than willing to call out abuse and historical unfairness, slavery, racism, oppression when it comes to Native American tribes, the horrible way that the American government often treated Native American tribes. But then the same kids that come to me with that awareness, that sort of woke awareness about the evils of Europeans, colonialist Americans, they remain utterly ignorant about the violent tendencies of Native tribes. I mean, when I ask my students to balance Columbus with the 500-year Aztec Empire, it's abundantly clear to me that our teachers aren't teaching them history from those broad perspectives. It's almost as if we assume that Western culture is bad, and because we are Americans or white people, we are not qualified to criticize the dangerous or the aggressive or the racist behavior of non-Western peoples. And so that multiculturalist paradigm that Western culture is pretty much always bad, and even if non-Western cultures have done bad things, we don't have the authority to hold them to account to that. I am very frustrated trying to right that ship with my students and try to give them a balanced picture.
Yeah. Well, the principles need to be, number one, no hypocrisy. Number two, no double standards. So, yes, let's try to understand the Aztec nation. Let's try to understand the Aztecs. And let's try to understand them on their own terms. And let's give a sympathetic reading to Aztec history in order to understand them on their own terms. But let's also recognize that we can cast moral judgments on the literally homicidal nature of Aztec religious practice. The mass, and I mean mass, sacrificial killings of human beings, the cruelty, the horrific injustice. So we need to condemn cruelty and injustice, whether it occurs in a Western nation or in Western culture or in some other culture. But we also have to try to understand cultures on their own terms. The truth in multiculturalism, which should be applied both to the West and to non-Western cultures, the truth in it is that we really should sympathetically try to understand on its own terms what's going on in those cultures, either current cultures or historically. The falsity is the idea that there's something uniquely bad about Western culture and that Western people cannot understand or make any judgments about non-Western cultures like Native American cultures, like Aztec culture, and so forth. So if we stick to these principles, no hypocrisy, no double standards, we'll be fine. We will advance the cause of knowledge, and we will advance our understanding of justice. Now, let me add something else here, if you don't mind. While we should not be tearing down statues of Columbus or erasing Junipero Serra, I think it's also true that there have been figures of importance in our history that have been neglected. And they should be brought into the foreground, sometimes for their serious heroism. An example is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, the great abolitionist. Most of my students don't know who Harriet Tubman is. There aren't actually enough monuments to Harriet Tubman, and in fact, the little museum in Auburn, New York, dedicated to Harriet Tubman, that was her house, is largely neglected. It was even neglected by President Obama when he visited the area a few years ago while he was president. And despite the repeated requests of the administration of the Harriet Tubman Museum to at least stop in, pay a little visit, do 5 minutes at the museum, he didn't do it. And it's not just Obama. A lot of people who should be recognizing the contributions of Tubman, and I'm just here using her as an example, don't recognize it. So there's room to be adding people to those among whom, for whom we actually erect monuments, do paintings, call attention, and so forth.
Excellent. I think broadening our historical understanding doesn't mean you have to remove things to make room for new figures. You can accommodate them all together. And so while we're on this, it goes back to the major question. Two things here. First one, why are we not seeing more academic historians calling this out, pointing out the fact that ideology is fine as far as it goes, but when ideology warps the way we pursue history, history loses, the study of history loses. Why does the academy seem, generally speaking, rather tolerant of these kinds of historical approaches that are in many ways anti-humane and anti-historical?
Oh, that's simple. It's because the people who should be calling these offenses out are afraid.
Mm-hmm. So basically it comes down to the peer pressure, knowing that you're going to get published if you have a certain attitude and perhaps not if you don't.
Yeah, the impact on people's careers. But look, we need courage. We need this in the academy, and we need courage. We need that virtue of courage for one simple reason. It's necessary, especially today, to the cause of truth-seeking and the cause of truth-telling. And those of us who are blessed to have academic appointments, to have vocations in the intellectual domain, have an obligation of truth-seeking and truth-telling. And if we're going to fulfill that obligation, if we're going to fulfill our vocation, if our institutions of higher learning, our colleges and universities are going to fulfill their mission as truth-seeking institutions, then we're going to have a little courage. We're going to have to stand up. We're going to have to take risks. We're going to have to speak out. And yes, I mean, those risks are real. People can be discriminated against for defying the prevailing cultural dogmas in the intellectual culture and academic life. And it's tough. It's hard. It's hard to take risks. And some people are going to, end up wounded, perhaps badly wounded, perhaps driven out of the academy for standing up and speaking the truth. But heroism is what we need. Courage is what we need. We're just going to have to do it.
And tenure was invented to protect people trying to make those heroic stands. My very last question for you is simply, with the removal of monuments, college, you said fear. College administrators share that fear, don't they, of perhaps offending a radicalized faculty. And so we're seeing monuments, we're seeing murals, we're seeing statues slowly vanish from college campuses. And again, as you said, wisely said a moment ago, there are certainly, these statues are complicated. Not every aspect of Columbus is venerable. Does that mean, though, we are right to purge campuses of this if students on campuses demand it? And my final question then is around that. Should we, as college campuses, be cleaning up the campus to avoid kids getting frustrated or upset? Or are we better off letting them confront those frustrations and using them as teaching experiences?
My beloved friend and teaching partner, Cornel West, says absolutely correctly that the whole point of a college education is to unsettle students. If we're not unsettling students, and if we're not allowing ourselves to be unsettled by our students, by our colleagues and others, if we're not challenging each other, if we're not unsettling each other, then we're not doing our job. It's really just that simple. Campuses should not be safe spaces. Campuses should be places where people confront ideas. Now, the whole truth needs to be told. I mean, you shouldn't do whitewashes of anybody, of Columbus, of Margaret Sanger. There shouldn't be whitewashes. But you shouldn't just erase important figures from our national history or make them disappear from campuses and other public places. Just tell the whole truth, provide the whole story, make sure that your students come out knowing the whole complicated story of Columbus or Sanger or Woodrow Wilson or Oliver Wendell Holmes or John F. Kennedy, or for that matter, Martin Luther King. As again, Cornell has pointed out, we rightly venerate King's courageous, profound witness on the cause of justice. But he was a flawed human being like all the rest of us. He had faults. We shouldn't erase those from the picture. We need to tell our students the whole truth. And that's true about everybody. We human beings are fallen, flawed creatures. And there's nobody who should be whitewashed. We need to tell the whole truth. But the whole truth does very often, as in the case of King, for example, include profound moments of heroism or profound features of heroism. Just tell the whole truth, that's all.
The truth, universal truth, universities. Professor George, it has been a great absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us very much.
Pleasure was mine.